What's happening, everybody? Justin, Bridgewater's finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter, fueled as always by the incredible folks at Nerd Tees, and boy do I have a big announcement that I talked about on my NFL stream last night, but a big announcement for this show. And welcome to the penultimate week of the CFL season. Yes, it is the East and West finals, the East Division final, the West Division final, the two of the final three games of the CFL season. It is exceptionally exciting. We did pretty well in round one with the East and West semifinals, went 4-2 overall, including getting both of the totals, hitting the under in the East and the over in the West. We definitely appreciate that. 4-2 overall. But what is going to happen in these East and West Division finals? Let's talk about it. The East Division final sees the Montreal Alouettes victorious last week, traveling to Toronto to take on the Toronto Argos, who have been basically head and shoulders the best team in the CFL right from the beginning of the season. Well, not quite the beginning, because of course they had a bye in week one, which again, one of the weirder things about the CFL, how a season can start and a team can have a bye in the very first week. And in the West, we have the BC Lions, winners last week against Calgary, traveling to Winnipeg to take on the Blue Bombers. Vegas is obviously predicting a Toronto and Winnipeg Grey Cup final, as the Argos are heavy favorites in the East Division final to the tune of -10.5, a big favorite, and Winnipeg a pretty solid favorite in the West Division final as well at -4.5. We got totals right around what they were last week, 50.5 in the East and 49.5 in the West. Get it, got it, good, and since you understood, let's go ahead and preview this East Division final. As I mentioned, the Alouettes were victorious last week against the Hamilton Ticats. That gets them into this game where they travel to take on a Toronto team that had their number this season. The Argos 3-0 against the Alouettes in 3 matchups this year, outscoring Montreal 97-57. So not particularly close in these matchups. The one game that took place in Toronto, like this game is, went to the Argos by a handy score of 39-10. So you're talking about a 4-possession game. The Argos were dominant. And dominance has basically been the name of the game for the Argos all season long, even when they haven't been at full strength. This is still like an elite team that does almost everything right. The Argos 16-2 on the season this year in the CFL, I believe tying the all-time CFL record. 13-5 against the spread as well, so Vegas tried their best. Vegas could not beat the Argos very consistently this season. They were also 10-8 to the over. At home, perfect record, 8-0 at home. That, of course, does not include the one game on neutral ground, Touchdown Atlantic, which I went to. They were 8-0 in Toronto this year, 7-1 against the spread in Toronto this year, going in even money 4-4 to the over. The Montreal Alouettes now moving their record to 12-7 on the season, 11-7-1 against the spread overall after covering last week, and the under pushed them to 8-11 to the over this season. Away from home, Alouettes were 6-3, definitely got the job done in the opposing building, 5-4 against the spread, and 5-4 to the over. Both of these teams are unbeaten in their last 4 games respectively, and they've basically gotten it done in very similar ways. The Argos are outscoring opponents 33-22 over that 4-game span. The Alouettes doubling their opponents up 28-14. So both of these teams certainly scoring their points, but it feels like defense has been the order of the day for these two teams. And you look at the defensive efficiency respectively for these teams in that span. Toronto 17.5, really good mark for defensive efficiency. Montreal 19.8, and once again, on an efficiency level, on offense you want little number, on defense you want big number. Both of these teams doing exceptionally well over this 4-game span. And again, these were meaningless games for the Argos. Montreal still had to, they still had plenty to play for down the stretch. 2 excellent marks for these defensive units. On offense, the Argos 13 is their mark in offensive efficiency, and Montreal 12.2. So what you'll notice is in both of these metrics, the Alouettes, outperformed the Toronto Argos in terms of offensive efficiency and defensive efficiency. Not really what I expected to see. My question marks going into this game are things that I'm definitely going to be paying very close attention to. Whether or not the Alouettes can repeat that whole team effort that they saw last week. It was on every level. The run game was going with William Stanback. The pass game was going with Fajardo. 2 touchdowns. He did have a pick, but he had a multi-touchdown game, which I talked about. He has not had a lot of those this season or lately. The defense was rolling. I believe it was Darnell Sankey not only had an interception, but had 3 sacks. Huge game for him. The Alouettes had 5 sacks as a team, 2 interceptions as a team on the offensive side of the ball and the defensive side of the ball. That whole team was moving in that game against the Ticats. Can they repeat that performance? This is the first meaningful game that the Toronto Argos will have played since week 15. With their win in week 15, they had already clinched the playoffs, but they clinched the East Division. They've had nothing to play for in 2 months. That's not to say that they just whatever, 2 months, throw whoever out there. They've definitely rotated some players and gotten some players some rest, which obviously they needed to do down the stretch here through the season, and you don't want to get one of your star players injured. But again, it's difficult to just turn that switch back on. They know in their heads, they know they have not played a meaningful game in 2 months. That is definitely one of those things you got to watch, especially early in this game, to try to, again, turn it back on and turn back into the Toronto Argos that they've been all season, especially early when nothing had been decided yet. Now the game's become decisive again, and that's something that you're going to have to watch out for. This Argos team has been incredible under any circumstance this season, but again, meaningful games. And I think the one true X factor here for the Toronto Argos is the play of AJ Wette. In those 3 head-to-head games against the Montreal Alouettes, here's AJ Wette's line just as a runner. This doesn't take his receiving prowess into consideration at all. Just as a runner, in the 3 games against the Alouettes in 2023, he carried the rock 43 times, 253 rushing yards, and not 1, not 2, but 3 rushing touchdowns in those 3 games. He ate the Alouettes alive in those 3 head-to-head matchups. I need to see what the Alouettes have learned. I would say they're arguably somewhat of a different team kind of down the stretch here than they had been the 3 times that they played the Argos earlier in the year. But if they don't have an answer for AJ Wette and what the Argos are able to do with their offensive line and in the run game, I think it's going to be a long day. I think what we'll do this a little differently. I'm going to move my picks for both games towards the end of the episode. So the next thing we're going to do is preview the West Final before I get into the 2 picks. But before I do that, I'm going to take the opportunity, as I always do, to shout out my great friends and sponsors at Nerd Teas and Coffee Bean. And like I said, something very exciting to tell you about. I mentioned it on my NFL stream last night. Black Friday is here early for the folks at Nerd Teas. You go to nerdteas.ca, no promo code required. You go to nerdteas.ca and you are going to save not 10, not 20, but 30%, essentially site-wide on anything you can get your hands on nerdteas.ca. Big Black Friday savings. It is a great time of year. So you want to go to nerdteas.ca, get those Black Friday 30% savings. You're going to get free shipping in Canada on any order over $100. That is still in effect, and you're still going to get a great conversion rate on the US dollar if you're one of my viewers in the US. Thank you so much for the support. Nerdteas.ca, huge Black Friday savings of 30%. When it's not Black Friday anymore, don't forget my promo code, which is BWFinest. That will save you 15% at checkout. No, unfortunately, the codes do not stack. Sorry about that, but 30%. Massive savings for Black Friday. Nerdteas.ca. Find yourself something to love, or find someone you love something to love. You can do it on nerdteas.ca. By the way, today's blend, one of the lovely flavored coffee blends that you can now find on nerdteas.ca. This is chocolate raspberry, and it is delicious. So let's talk about the West Final now. The BC Lions in Winnipeg taking on the Bombers. Season series between these 2 teams was 2-1 in favor of the Bombers, where the Bombers outscored the Lions 90-70 in those 3 games, so averaging 30 points a game. were the Bombers against BC. In Winnipeg, these two teams split the two games, scoring margin obviously closer, 56-44 in favor of Winnipeg. And these two teams, the first two games that they played were wild blowouts on both sides. BC blew them out, I believe, in week 4, something like that, week 4, week 6. Later on, Winnipeg came back and did it to them. And those was two games where you didn't have the starting quarterbacks that we will assumedly have in this game. The big BC loss, that was a Dane Evans start. The big Winnipeg loss was the game where Zach Collaros got hurt. Their most recent game, a tight, high-scoring matchup that went into overtime. This season, the Bombers had an impressive 14-4 mark straight up. They were 11-7 against the spread and 13-5 to the over this year. Plenty of points to be had in Winnipeg Blue Bombers games. In Winnipeg, they were massive. 8-1 straight up, 7-2 against the spread, and 6-3 to the over. The BC Lions improving their record last week to a 13-6 mark overall this season, 9-1 against the spread, and 12-6-1 to the over. So what we can basically say here is expect a lot of points. And on the road, the BC Lions 6-3 straight up, 5-4 against the spread, and hit 6 of 9 overs. Over the last 4 games, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers have an unbeaten record of 4-0, outscoring opponents by 2 full possessions, 37-21, a 16-point margin of victory in those 4 games. Offensive efficiency and defensive efficiency both looked good. On offense, it's 12.5, defense 15.1. So both of those marks, pretty darn good, and the one that's lower is the one you want to be lower. Bit of a different story here for the BC Lions. Despite the win last week, still only 2-2 in their last 4 games, actually being outscored by 5 points on average in those 4 games, being outscored 29-34. We talked about the defensive struggles for the Lions last week. 25 or more points against now, I believe, in 10 straight games and 11 of their last 12. So again, we know the defensive struggles. The efficiency marks bear that out as well. They're 13.5 on offense, nothing wrong with that. But defensively, their efficiency is 12.2. The smaller number is not on the side of the docket that you want it to be on. You want the smaller number to be on the offensive side. It is not the case for the Lions. And I talked about that, 25 points against at least in, 10 straight games. It's gotten worse. They've now given up 30 or more in all 4 of those last 4 games. So obviously, I ask again, where's the defense? Where is this stout BC Lions defense that they spent 2 years building and at times early this season and through last season looked utterly dominant? It looks like it's just not here anymore. Now, what I will say, the caveat being, they made some defensive plays in that game last week against Calgary that really did make the difference. They picked off Jake Maier twice. The defense wasn't all doom and gloom, but you can't necessarily depend on that in every single game. This is a significant step up in competition. Jake Maier stepping up to Zach Collaros. There's levels to this, and this is different. But one thing that may be going in the Lions' favor is if you look at the injury list right now for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, it is long and it is significant. Zach Collaros is on that list. Nick Dembski, Dalton Schoen are on that list. Willie Jefferson is on that list. Winston Rose is on that list. Adam Bighill is on that list. Now, Winnipeg is one of those teams where their injured list can often be a fugazi. They're just not disclosing, and somehow they keep getting away with it. So this injured list could be a deception, or it could be a problem. And we won't really know, like Willie Jefferson, again, we won't really know, I guess, until closer to game time, who's actually going to be out there and who isn't, but it does make you a little bit nervous. Vernon Adams with a 5-touchdown masterclass last week, 2 through the air, 3 on the ground. Basically, the Lions' entire rush offense in that game. Taquan Mazzell had some touches, didn't really do a ton with them. But we're also only a month removed from, again, that Week 18 overtime loss. And why do I bring that up? I bring that up because the BC Lions blew multiple double-digit leads in that football game, gave things up basically in the last 2 to 3 minutes of the game. It goes to overtime and they lose. This is where the defensive problems really came to the forefront, that they just could not hold a lead. And again, that's a recent game. That's in week 18. I find it nearly impossible to trust this Lions defense right now. So yes, Vernon was incredible last week. Is it enough? So like I mentioned, the Argos come in at minus 10.5 point favorites, very heavy favorites in the East Final. Winnipeg minus 4.5, so definitely a favorite, more than a field goal, a fairly strong favorite, but not overwhelmingly so. Vegas says it's going to be a Toronto-Winnipeg Grey Cup. Do I agree? Yes, I believe I do. Montreal and Toronto is going to be an interesting football game, but we saw the Argos. It didn't matter who they were playing. It didn't matter who was in the Argos roster. Their potency didn't go anywhere. Like, you can just, when you can roll a team that deep and it didn't really matter who was playing, that's a sign of incredible coaching. It's a sign of an incredibly built roster. I think they're the best built roster in the CFL right now. I just don't see a path to Montreal winning this football game. So we're going to go with the Toronto Argos, obviously picking up the win in the East Division Final. However, I'm not going to lay that many points. Double digits in a playoff game like this. Montreal's defense has been on fire lately. They can definitely score their points to keep up here. 10.5 is just too many for me. So I am going to hedge my bets, take the Argos to win outright, but I'm going to take the plus 10.5 on the Montreal Alouettes. Total in this game set at 50.5. Again, two defenses that are playing exceptionally good football right now. Give me the under on this one. I do think it gets into the mid to high 40s, but I don't think it gets to 50. So give me under 50.5 points in Toronto, Montreal. Let's go Argos 27, Alouettes 20. So Argos win, Alouettes cover the plus 10.5, and give me the under on the points. Out west, look, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers are head and shoulders the best team in the West Division. I do not trust the BC Lions on defense. This is a track meet, more so than last week with BC and Calgary, and BC just is not going to be able to keep up in a track meet with Winnipeg if their defense is playing the way that it has been for the last almost the entirety of the season. Like, I don't think you can pick with it. So we're going to take the Winnipeg Blue Bombers here at home to get the win over the BC Lions to go to the Grey Cup final, and I am going to lay the minus 4.5 on Winnipeg. 4.5 points, a fairly close margin, especially with the way the CFL has been this season. That's essentially a minus 3 to me, basically, with the way the CFL season has gone. So I don't mind laying minus 4.5 in what will be a high-scoring game that goes well over the 49.5 point total. Like, I've got this game getting into the 60s, so 49.5. No problem there whatsoever. That might even be a number that, like, if you really wanted to get ballsy, maybe you tease it up if you're doing some teasers, same game parlays, whatever you want to do. I've got the game getting into the 60s. We're going to go 37-24 in favor of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. So Bombers straight up. Bombers handily cover the minus 4.5 and give me a handy over on the point total. So there we go. To the surprise of no one, I've got the Toronto Argos and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers meeting in the Grey Cup final next week. How do you think that game is going to go? Do you fully disagree with me? Do you think either Montreal or BC comes up with the upset this week? Let me know in the comments section below. That's it for me, Justin, Bridgewater's finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter, fueled as always by the incredible folks at Nerd Tees, who once again, Black Friday, ladies and gentlemen. Black Friday at nerdtees.ca. 30% off savings on basically everything site-wide. No better time to become a Nerd Tees customer. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you again for the final CFL video of the season, the Grey Cup preview.